We're going to talk to a man who knows a thing or two about sports injuries. He has experience on the high school level. He's got Division I experience. He's got other collegiate experiences. He's been a volleyball trainer. He's been a basketball trainer, baseball trainer, football trainer. He's been in the NFL, dealing with aches and pains of NFL players. He knows what he's talking about. Tyler Branham, welcome to the show.
Hey, what's up, Rob? How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Good to be on with you.
It's early morning this morning for you. I guess you have things to do early in the morning anyways, but thanks for joining us.
I've been up about a solid 2 hours now, so we're doing good. You're catching me when I'm full energy.
Wow, you're hitting your steam right now.
That's right.
2 hours. What are you, studying?
Yeah, I am. Absolutely.
Classic.
And, saying that's what I'm doing. I'm not quite sure.
Classic Tyler Branham. Okay, well, let's get you in and out here. I know you have places to be. So just first off, what is a partially collapsed lung, and is it different than a classic collapsed lung?
So just in general, a collapsed lung occurs when there's some type of trauma. Most people think of a piercing trauma, something actually pokes the lung or pokes something and causes it to happen. But kind of, like we saw this past weekend, blunt force trauma can also be a cause of a collapsed lung. And so what happens is, for one reason or another, the cavity where the lungs sit start to fill with air, and it pushes on the lungs, so those lungs can't fully expand. And so you can tend to get some issues breathing, although with a partial collapse, sometimes there could be very, very minor symptoms. Some, if it's small enough, maybe asymptomatic as well. So anyways, that air starts pushing on the lungs. The fortunate thing with a partial collapse, that means that there's at least some part of the lung that is still able to expand. You can still get air in there, but there is still that part that's being pushed on. It's being collapsed by the air that's in the cavity that shouldn't be there, and it can't fully expand. So there are other types of, fully collapsed lungs, for lack of a better term, that are associated either with just being spontaneous, because of a disease or something like that. And those can be life-threatening. They tend to completely collapse the lung. You can't get air in the cavity because the lungs can't expand, and it can start to affect things like the heart. Can be life-threatening, but we're fortunate anytime you see a partial collapse, because that's something that, although it's serious, it's definitely a little bit better outlook than obviously the other things that I've mentioned.
So if you have the collapsed lung, it stays collapsed. It doesn't just puff back up. It takes some time.
So it does take some time, but a lot of times with a partial collapse, it can actually, it can be monitored through X-ray. There's some other things that can be done,
right,
surgically, other things like that. But if a partial collapse is not that serious, they can literally just kind of give the person oxygen and watch it over a few days via X-ray or some other type of imaging. And sometimes, yes, it can kind of just blow back out on its own, and the air, can be removed from the cavity kind of on its own. So,
okay,
if it's not serious enough, it can really resolve on its own with just a little bit of oxygen and a little bit of time. So
is it normal to have a partially collapsed lung? I know you mentioned the puncture wounds. Is it normal to have a blunt force partially collapsed lung without a broken rib or anything else?
Well, first of all, in general, it's not normal to have a collapsed lung.
Okay. So it's not a common thing.
No, it's not that. I mean, I've definitely seen it, but it's pretty rare. You do see it in tall, young, skinny people. So
I'm safe then.
Oh yeah, and I am too.
Okay.
No doubt. Yeah. But most people do think of this happening by maybe a rib fracture or something like that, which can be true. But this blunt force trauma, which it looks like that's what happened this past weekend. It can happen with that. Now, it's more likely to have a collapsed lung if you have a fracture, obviously, because you have a jagged piece of something in the cavity that's not supposed to be there, and that can cause it. But typically, if there is no other injury, it's really just because the pressure from the hit, did something to the lungs, and and air got in there, and it's not supposed to be in there. So I will say, it was an incredibly fortunate situation that there was a partial collapsed lung, albeit probably less common than if there were no other injuries present.
It's interesting. I guess if you do crack a rib, it's not a blunt force collapsed lung, it's a puncture because the ribs are sharp in there that got broke.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of a different way to. It's a different way to look at it. It's just. I mean, blunt force can cause a fracture, but in terms of describing how the lung was injured,
right. Popped.
You kind of look at it as either blunt force or.
So I guess with Alan Bowman specifically, I think he's on his way out or out of the hospital. I think misdirecting talk there about where he is exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But is there a general timetable for something like that if there was no broken ribs, or we don't have to talk about Alan Bowman specifically? Hypothetically, if there was a partially collapsed lung and there was no broken ribs, what's the timetable? Because I think there would be a higher chance for partially collapsed lungs if you have one to go back into I mean, it's not like he's going back into normal daily activity. He's going to get hit again.
Right. I obviously don't know an exact timetable because I know almost zero about the, things surrounding this. But, with partially collapsed lung, if the person's healthy, like I mentioned earlier, the lung can kind of expand on its own fairly quickly. Again, I don't know if that's what's happening here, but
right. No, hypothetically, yeah, not about Alan Bowman.
It can go back to normal pretty quickly. It totally depends on what the doctors are seeing, what they're comfortable with in terms of returning someone back to their normal activities. And normal activities at this point actually are just making sure that someone can go back to normal daily activities. Now, throwing football in there is something different. But, just kind of looking at a normal person who, just goes to work.
Right.
Once the lungs expand back to normal, which could be a few days, you kind of keep an eye on them. They can ease back into things and resume daily activities. And, you could be looking at week and a half, 2 weeks. I don't know. That's a gross estimate. But
sure,
returning to football itself would naturally add probably a little bit of time. But just for the fact of, resting for a few days in a hospital can kind of be, it could be a setback in terms of being in game shape.
So when you hear people saying 1, 2 weeks, that's not football weeks. That's just this kid can go to class again.
The 1 week it would be like, okay, that's not a football week. 2 weeks it could be.
Okay.
I'm not there. I don't know,
sure.
And there's a lot of factors that play into it. And the biggest goal is, you want to make sure that these patients, and if they're athletes, you need to ensure that they can work out, run, do all the things they need to do symptom-free, and then have the endurance to do it. Which I can't speak on, how much of a setback it is when you're talking about being in game shape, because every person's different. But I would definitely say, it would be hard to start tossing a rock around 1 week after it happened. But, again, maybe it could, where we're dealing with the population that have rare talents and bodies that can typically heal a little bit better than someone like me who plays softball on the weekends.
Right. So what is the rehab? Are you just, blowing in that little thing with the ball in it with the tube? I mean, is that all you do for rehab for a blown lung or what?
Well, in terms of rehab for a lung, so if you're in the hospital, the whole reason you're in the hospital is to make sure that lung fully expands and you're back to normal. So really the rehab, and this is where it's kind of on the athletic trainers like myself, and then, the strength conditioning coaches, they start kind of putting athletes, patients who have had this through a workout and making sure that they can build up to being in game shape. So, it's not like a hamstring strain where you start doing some hamstring curls, doing all these different exercises to try to strengthen the muscle.
There's no lung lifts.
Exactly. Yeah, there's no squats for the lungs. You're really just trying to get back into doing some cardio specifically and trying to just regain those normal activities. And you are kind of referring to making sure that, their lungs are functioning properly, but a lot of that stuff's done in the hospital before, they're even released by physicians.
Okay. So hypothetically, if a person had a partially collapsed lung and they leave the hospital, that's good news that they are close to wherever they need to be for at least health.
Yeah, to be a healthy person, they're in good shape.
Thanks for calling in, man. I appreciate
Yep,
you. We're going to get you again when something else happens.
Absolutely. Hey, man, it was a pleasure, and have a great day, man.
All right, you too.
All right, brother.